I didn't take the job because I loved the sea, or because I believed in renewable energy, or any of the reasons people put on forms when they want to sound like they belong somewhere better than they do. I took it because the bank kept calling at breakfast and at lunch, and sometimes after midnight, like they knew that was when I was weakest, when the house felt bigger than it was and the silence stretched long enough for regret to sit down next to me and start talking like an old friend. The business had been mine, or at least I told people it was mine. A logistics company that never quite got off the ground because I kept taking shortcuts that felt clever at the time and criminal in hindsight. Which meant invoices went unpaid, drivers quit, and eventually the numbers didn't lie anymore, even though I kept trying to. And by the time it collapsed, it took more than money with it. It took my wife's patience, my brother's trust, and whatever version of myself I used to recognize in the mirror. So when a recruiter called about offshore maintenance work, good pay, long shifts, no questions asked, I said yes before he finished explaining the safety protocols, and I packed a bag like I was leaving for something temporary, which is how you lie to yourself when you know you're not coming back the same. The North Sea doesn't welcome you. It tolerates you, the way a landlord tolerates a tenant who pays just enough to stay. The platform smelled like salt and rust and old diesel, and the turbines stretched out across the dark water like a graveyard of giants frozen mid-stride, their blades turning slow and steady during the day and almost hypnotic at night, like they were counting something none of us could see. Night shift was where they put the men who didn't ask questions, which suited me fine because questions had been the start of most of my problems. The lights overhead flickered with a rhythm you could never quite predict, and the coffee came from a machine that tasted like it had been brewing the same batch since the 90s, thick and bitter enough to coat your tongue so you couldn't tell if you were drinking it or chewing it. The foreman was a man named Halverson, who had a voice like gravel under boots and eyes that never quite focused on you, as if he was always looking past you at something just out of reach. He handed me a folded piece of paper on my first night, and he didn't explain it, didn't even look at me when he passed it over, just said, "Read it when you need it," which felt like the kind of advice you don't argue with because it sounds like it came from somewhere you don't want to visit. I tucked it into my jacket and forgot about it until the sea went quiet. You learn the sounds first out there, because sight doesn't help much when everything beyond the platform is black and shifting. There's the constant low churn of the turbines, the distant slap of waves against steel, and the wind, always the wind, threading through everything like a living thing that refuses to leave you alone. Except that night, sometime around 3 in the morning, it all stopped. Not gradually, not like a machine powering down, but all at once, like someone had taken the world and pressed pause. I was halfway up the access ladder on Turbine 6, my gloves slick with grease and my arms already starting to ache from the climb, when I noticed it. Because the silence hit me harder than any noise ever had, pressing against my ears until I felt like I needed to swallow just to make sure I could still hear anything at all. I climbed the rest of the way out of habit, because stopping halfway up a ladder over open water isn't something your body lets you do easily. And when I reached the platform, I stood there with my breath fogging in the cold air and realized I couldn't hear the sea anymore. That's when I remembered the paper. I pulled it out with stiff fingers and unfolded it under the flickering maintenance light. And the first line was written in block letters, neat and deliberate, like whoever wrote it wanted to make sure there was no room for misunderstanding. Rule 1. If the ocean goes silent, turn off all the lights. I laughed, because that's what you do when something feels too strange to take seriously, and the sound of it felt wrong in the silence. like I was breaking a rule I didn't know existed yet. There was a guy named Miller. Halverson had mentioned him once over coffee that tasted like rust and regret. And Miller had been the kind of man who whistled while he worked, not because he was happy, but because he needed to fill the space around him with something that felt like control. He'd been here back in '92, when the turbines were newer and the rules weren't written down yet, or at least not in a way anyone admitted to. Miller was up on Turbine 2 when the sea went quiet for him, and instead of turning off the lights, he cranked them brighter. Every floodlight and maintenance lamp he could reach, because he thought more light meant more safety, which is the kind of logic that works on land and fails out here where the rules don't belong to you. They found him the next morning, still standing on the platform, eyes wide open, skin pale like he'd been drained of something essential, and the lights were still on around him, flickering in a way that made the shadows stretch too far, like they were trying to leave the bodies that cast them. What bothered the crew wasn't that he was dead, because death happens in places like this, and men learn to carry it like another tool in their belt, but that his shadow was still moving after the sun came up, sliding across the metal in slow, deliberate motions, like it hadn't realized it was supposed to stop. They shut down Turbine 2 for a week after that, and when they brought it back online, the shadow was gone, but the stories stayed, because stories don't need permission to linger. I stood there thinking about Miller, about how a man can make a small decision in the wrong moment and pay for it in ways no one can explain, and I reached over and switched off the light. The darkness came in fast, swallowing the edges of the platform until all I had was the faint outline of the turbine against a sky that didn't look any different from the sea below it. And for a moment, I felt like I was floating in nothing at all. And then, slowly, the sound came back. The wind first, low and uncertain, then the distant churn of the turbines, and finally, the sea, breathing again like it had been holding something down and decided to let it go. I didn't finish the maintenance that night. I climbed down and went back to the platform, and I didn't say anything to anyone because some things feel smaller when you speak them out loud, and I wasn't ready for that yet. The work doesn't stop just because you're unsettled. Machines don't care how you feel, and neither does the schedule. So the next night I was back out there, climbing, tightening, checking, moving from one turbine to the next like I was trying to outrun something I couldn't name. The cold gets into your joints after a while, and your hands start to feel like they belong to someone else, slow and clumsy, and the coffee only does so much before it turns on you, leaving a sour taste at the back of your throat that you can't wash away no matter how much you drink. I brought a sandwich with me that night, mostly out of habit, something wrapped in wax paper that had been sitting in the fridge long enough to forget when it was made. I didn't know why I brought it until I saw her. She was standing near the edge of the platform between turbines 4 and 5, where there shouldn't have been anyone at that hour, especially not someone who looked like they'd stepped out of a different decade entirely, wearing a coat that hung too heavy on her shoulders and a scarf that moved in the wind even when the air felt still. The second line on the paper came to me then, not because I'd read it recently, but because something in the back of my mind had been waiting for the moment it would make sense. Rule 2. Always bring a spare sandwich. The old lady waits for it every night. There was a man named Ortiz who used to work the night shift, Halverson had said, and Ortiz was the kind of guy who talked about retirement like it was a place you could drive to if you just saved enough and didn't make too many mistakes along the way. He didn't believe in the rules, not really, and for a while that worked out for him because disbelief can be a kind of shield if you hold on to it hard enough. He forgot the sandwich one night. Or maybe he decided not to bring it, which is a different kind of forgetting. The kind where you convince yourself something isn't important until it proves you wrong. They said he saw her the same way I did, standing there with that patient stillness, and when he told her he didn't have anything for her, she just nodded, like she'd expected that answer all along. The next morning they found Ortiz in the water, not far from the platform. And the strange part wasn't that he'd fallen, because accidents happen, but that his pockets were full of bread. Dozens of small pieces packed in tight like he'd been trying to carry something that wouldn't stay whole. I stood there with the sandwich in my hand, feeling ridiculous and terrified in equal measure, and I walked toward her slowly, because sudden movements felt like a bad idea in a place where the rules were written by things that didn't need to explain themselves. She took the sandwich without a word, her fingers cold enough that I felt it through my gloves, and she nodded once, then stepped back toward the edge. For a second I thought she might fall, or jump, or simply disappear, but she just stood there, looking out at the sea like she was waiting for something that might never come. I didn't stay to watch. The nights started to blur together after that, each one carrying its own weight of small, strange moments that didn't add up to anything I could explain, but felt like they were building toward something all the same. Turbine 3 had a reputation. You hear about these things in places like this, whispered between shifts, mentioned in passing like jokes that aren't really jokes, and Turbine 3 was the one people avoided if they could. Not because it broke down more often, but because when it did, it never felt like a simple mechanical failure. Rule 3. If you see Turbine 3 stops, do not climb up to check it. There was a guy named Petrov who ignored that rule, back when he still thought experience meant immunity. And Petrov had been one of the best technicians they'd ever had, the kind of man who could listen to a machine and tell you what was wrong with it before the diagnostics even ran. Turbine 3 stopped one night, just froze mid-rotation like it had been caught in a photograph, and Petrov climbed up without hesitation, tools in hand and confidence in his step. They lost radio contact with him halfway up. When they finally got someone else to climb after him, they found the ladder empty, but the platform above was covered in footprints that didn't match any boots they issued, too long and narrow, like something had been walking there that didn't quite understand how feet were supposed to work. Petrov was never found. I saw Turbine 3 stop on my 5th night. It happened without warning, the blades locking in place against a sky that seemed too still for the wind we were supposed to be having, and every instinct I had as a technician told me to climb up and fix it, because that's what you do when something breaks. Instead, I turned away. I don't know if that saved my life, but I know it kept me from finding out what happened to Petrov. And sometimes, not knowing is the only kind of mercy you get. By the time the week was almost over, I felt like I'd been there for months, my body running on habit and caffeine and a kind of stubbornness that had gotten me into trouble before and didn't seem interested in changing now. The ladders were the worst part, especially late into the shift when your muscles started to protest and your mind wandered into places it shouldn't, replaying old mistakes and missed chances like a highlight reel you never asked for. That's when I noticed the footprints. They were on the ladder leading up to Turbine 5, faint but unmistakable, pressed into the thin layer of grease and salt that coats everything out there. And they weren't mine. Rule 4. If you find footprints on the ladder that aren't yours, climb down slowly. Do not look up, even if something is climbing with you. There was a man named Jensen, and Jensen had a habit of looking for problems because he believed that if you could see something clearly enough, you could fix it. Which is a comforting idea until you run into something that doesn't want to be seen. He found footprints like these. And instead of climbing down, he looked up. No one knows exactly what he saw because he didn't live long enough to explain it, but the way they found him at the base of the ladder suggested he'd tried to come down in a hurry, slipping, missing rungs, his body bearing the kind of injuries that don't come from a simple fall. I kept my eyes down. Every instinct I had screamed at me to look because curiosity is a hard thing to kill. But I focused on the rungs, on the rhythm of my breathing, on anything that would keep my head pointed in the right direction. Halfway down, I heard it. Something above me, moving in time with me but not quite matching my pace, like it was learning as it went. I didn't look. I reached the bottom with my hands shaking and my heart pounding hard enough that I could feel it in my teeth. And when I finally stepped back and looked up, there was nothing there. The reality broke the next night. The report said there were hurricane-force winds in the area, the kind that should have had the turbines spinning so fast they blurred into pale circles against the sky. But when I stepped out onto the platform, everything was still. Every turbine frozen mid-rotation, the sea flat and silent, the air heavy and unmoving. It felt like the world had been emptied of motion, like someone had taken all the moving parts and set them aside to see what would happen if everything just stopped. And in that stillness, I understood something I hadn't wanted to. The turbines weren't just harvesting wind. They were harvesting something else. I don't know how to explain what came next without sounding like I've lost my mind. And maybe I have. But out there, in that silence, I felt watched in a way that went beyond eyes and into something deeper. Like every decision I'd ever made was being weighed against me. The debts, the shortcuts, the people I'd hurt without meaning to, or worse, without caring enough to stop. It all felt present, like the air itself was thick with it. And I realized then that the rules weren't there to protect us from the sea, or the turbines, or even whatever walked those ladders at night. They were there to give us a chance. A way to navigate something that was older than the machines we'd built and more patient than any of us could afford to be. I thought about Miller and Ortiz and Petrov and Jensen, and I understood that they hadn't just broken rules. They'd been found wanting. I stood there in the stillness, feeling the weight of my own failures pressing down on me. And for the first time in a long time, I didn't try to justify them, didn't look for excuses or explanations. I just acknowledged them. And slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, the wind returned. Dawn came like it always does, quiet and indifferent, painting the sea in shades of gray that looked almost peaceful if you didn't know what lay beneath. I finished my shift without incident, if you can call it that, and I packed my things with a kind of care I hadn't felt before. Like I was handling something fragile, even though it was just clothes and tools and the same old life waiting for me on shore. The drive home was long and silent, the roads empty in that early hour when the world hasn't quite decided to wake up yet. And I found myself thinking about the business, about the people I'd let down, about the version of myself I might still have a chance to become if I stopped running from the things I'd done. I don't know if the turbines are still out there, spinning and watching and waiting, or if what I experienced was something that only happens once, to people who need it more than they're willing to admit. But I kept the paper, folded and worn, tucked into my wallet like a reminder that some debts aren't measured in money, and some rules aren't meant to be broken, no matter how certain you are that you understand the world better than it understands you.